Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Johnny Robertson. This is my co-host Charlie C. And we'd like to welcome you back to Election Detection, the weekly radio show that detects elects. Charlie's got the list of countries to be discussed today. Charlie, why don't you take it away?
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to open up with a continuation of our previous story regarding Montenegro and discussing their recent election, in which the fate of democracy itself in the small Balkan nation was on the line. We're then going to take a look at Japan and the surprise resignation of their prime minister, before heading to South America and the landlocked country of Bolivia to discuss their recent political crisis and their election, which was originally scheduled for September and has now been postponed to October. We're then going to take a look at some of the protests and the fallout from the election in Belarus before heading to Sri Lanka to discuss their 2018 political crisis and the results of their 2019 presidential election and 2020 parliamentary election. Finishing off tonight, we're going to take a look at Hong Kong, which has recently postponed their election until next year, and discuss some of the protests and other things that we've been hearing from that nation. Alrighty, starting off our program tonight, we're heading to Montenegro. We discussed Montenegro in our previous episode and gave a breakdown of their election polls as they were heading into their August 30th election. This election was long anticipated in the small Balkan nation as it became increasingly polarized. The election ended in a razor-thin victory for the new coalition government, resulting in the country's first change in government since the introduction of the multi-party system 3 decades ago when the region was still part of the now-defunct Republic of Yugoslavia. President Milo Đukanovic's party, the Democratic Party of Socialists, or DPS, had held power in Montenegro through a series of majority, minority, or coalition governments since 1990. President Đukanovic himself has served as either president or prime minister for much of that time, holding one of those two seats in every year except 2007 and 2011. The DPS has come under fire in recent years for a number of reasons. Internationally, they have been cited as growing increasingly authoritarian, with Montenegro being downgraded on the democracy index from a democracy to a hybrid regime for the first time since 2003. In the aftermath of the 2016 parliamentary elections, the opposition began to boycott parliamentary proceedings in protest of unjust electoral practices. Domestically, the DPS have also been the targets of mass protests regarding a controversial law on religious properties. The law revoked ownership of churches and estates from the Serbian Orthodox Church and transferred them to the Montenegrin state. Đukanovic and his party also received strong opposition from Serbia and Russia regarding Montenegro's 2017 ascension to NATO membership. In the wake of the DPS loss in the recent election, widespread celebrations broke out in Serbia's capital of Belgrade, mirroring those in Montenegro's own capital of Podgorica. The DPS has also had a troubled relationship with neighboring Serbia. President Đukanovic led much of the separatism movement that resulted in the dissolution of the Serbia and Montenegro Union states in 2006, and holds a pro-Western stance that opposed that of the pro-Russian Serbian government. Đukanovic's assassination was also the goal of a failed coup d'etat attempt in 2016. Following his party's loss at the polls, Đukanovic has also accused Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić of election meddling. Đukanovic has also described the DPS loss as a threat to Montenegrin independence, owing to the new government's pro-Serbia positions. While his party lost power, Đukanovic does not face a challenge to his presidency until 2023. Political scientists globally have described the DPS loss as a good day for democracy, with opposition leader Zdravko Krivokapic stating, "The tyranny is over, the regime has fallen." Montenegro's new coalition government is comprised of 3 political groups representing 9 parties across a broad political spectrum. While the DPS holds the most seats of a single party, with 30, the new coalition holds a razor-thin majority of 41 in the 81-seat parliament. Leading the new government is the Right Wing for the Future of Montenegro coalition, with 27 seats split between 3 parties. The Peace is Our Nation coalition is made up of 5 centrist parties, with 2 of them winning 10 seats between them. The final member of the new government is the United Reform Action, a Green party with 4 seats. The Social Democratic Party, part of the DPS opposition, also won 2 seats, but did not join the governing coalition. The Social Democrats, Bosniak Party, Albanian Coalition, and Albanian List round out parliament with 1 to 3 seats each, and the Croatian Civic Initiative has been pushed out of parliament after losing its single seat. In a follow-up to its 2016 audit that led to calls for electoral reform in Montenegro, The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe has announced its findings on the 2020 election. It has stated that the elections were highly competitive and held in a state of high polarization over religion and national identity. They also concluded that this election was not held under fair circumstances due to the DPS controlling all media, persecuting opposition MPs, and profiting unjustly through abuse of office and state resources. As the new government finds its footing as the first to unseat the DPS, its priorities include fielding a prime minister designate, securing fair cooperation within its own coalition, fighting corruption, overcoming societal polarization, overturning the controversial religion law, and continuing Montenegro's bid to join the European Union. Alrighty, so this is interesting as we came out of the last episode with all of the polls stating that it was likely that the DPS were just going to win another government. It's definitely interesting to see the first changeover in 30 years of government in Montenegro.
Oh, absolutely. We definitely started this program at a really great time to be able to witness something like this.
Oh yeah, definitely. Especially where it's a coalition government. It really kind of shows sort of national unity against an increasingly authoritarian government where we've got a coalition made of really three principal parties, and they couldn't be farther apart on the political spectrum as we've got the right wing, the centrists, and the left wing all represented in this one coalition.
Yeah, it's like the Captain Planet of Montenegrin politics.
Yeah, pretty much. Especially as after getting elected, they all specifically the leaders of the new coalition have all specifically put out essentially an invite to join the coalition to all of the minority parties, like the Albanian parties and the Croatian parties, in Montenegrin politics, sort of to form a more unified parliament.
That's interesting to see.
Oh, absolutely. Another thing with the leaders of the parties that we actually discussed briefly the other day while we were researching this episode was that two of the three principal party leaders are under the age of 35.
It's quite an interesting trend to see in Eastern Europe, seeing a lot of young people getting into politics to the point where a lot of them are becoming new party leaders.
Absolutely.
And call it a stretch of ill, but I definitely think seeing such a huge shakeup like this, government-wise, I think is definitely a I don't want to say side effect because that makes it sound like a bad thing, but it's just the result. Result.
Yeah,
because it's amazing to see something that's been standing rigidly as much as the DPS holding power for so long and have it shook up.
And I mean it's one thing to talk about, oh well, you have various dictators in various countries, but when you think about it, and you don't hear about Montenegro that much just because it's a fairly small country, all things considered. But when you look at the electoral record, especially going back to the early 90s, people talk about, oh well, is or isn't Vladimir Putin a dictator? But the same questions could be raised about Milo Đukanović, whereas he's been in party in power, swapping back and forth between two seats just for 25 years. They're actually 30 years at this point.
Yeah.
And that's definitely one thing that'll be interesting to see, where the new party is almost more closer in line with the Russian political stance and the Serbian political stance but they're still planning on joining the European Union, as they could be almost a bridge of sorts between sort of the more Western sphere of political intent and the more Russian and Central Eurasian sphere of political intent.
It'd be quite fascinating.
Yeah, indeed. And especially, we also talk about the fact that the three parties, two of them are led by people under the age of 35. But the governmental support party, the Social Democratic Party, is also led by I can't actually remember her last name at the moment, but we discussed her in the last episode as she was the first female presidential candidate in Montenegro's history, and is the leader of the governmental support party now, and is, I think, 42. So it's quite a young government moving forward as well, which is definitely something that I like to see.
Yeah.
Especially where. Oh, sorry, continue.
It's definitely something much needed in the political world.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Especially whereas especially in the States, regardless of who wins this election, you're going to have a global superpower with one of the oldest leaders in their literally the oldest leader in their history, regardless of who wins the election in the States. So it's nice to see the smaller nations sort of coming up with a millennial perspective, basically.
Yeah. It reminds me of there's this really dumb article I found. God, it was a few years back now, probably. But it was like, should millennials be allowed to participate in politics? And it's like, what's your understanding of time?
Yeah, oh yeah, I remember that one. It was it wasn't a Fox thing after AOC was first elected. Yeah.
Yeah, it was something or some sort of likely Fox affiliated publisher.
Yeah.
So when people ask, or question the validity of millennials getting involved in politics, all I do is look at a country like Montenegro after something like this and say, well, it should be a resounding yes.
Yeah, exactly.
These young people seem to have an ability to put, a lot of party differences aside and actually enact real change, as we've seen with Montenegro here.
Yeah, exactly. And I wouldn't even stop with millennials, as we discussed with Judy in the last episode, is Gen Zs in their late teens or early 20s, depending on which generational cutoff you go by. So we need to get them in there too.
Yeah.
The future of animals everywhere is at risk. In the last 40 years, over half of the world's animal populations have disappeared. Biodiversity is in crisis, and we need to do something now to reverse this alarming trend. Earth Rangers knows that no one cares more about animals than our children, and by providing them with the tools and the inspiration to take action, kids can make a real difference to the survival of wildlife. Already, thousands of children across Canada are joining forces as Earth Rangers to help protect animals and their habitats. To get your child involved or to make a donation, please visit earthrangers.com.
Providing airtime to independent artists everywhere. CHMR FM.
So our next story this afternoon takes us all the way to Japan, where in the last few weeks we've received a surprise announcement from Japan's Prime Minister. On August 28th, Shinzo Abe announced his resignation. Abe's resignation comes in the face of his years-long struggle against incurable bowel disease. Upon announcing his resignation, he states, "I've decided that I will step down as Prime Minister with the belief that I cannot continue being Prime Minister if I do not have the confidence that I can carry out the job entrusted to me by the people. For almost 8 years, I controlled my chronic disease. However, this year in June, I had a regular checkup and there was sign of said disease." He adds, "I made a judgment that I should not continue my job as Prime Minister. I need to fight the disease and need to be treated. I apologize from the bottom of my heart that despite all the support from the Japanese people, I am leaving the post with 1 full year left in my term and in the midst of various policies and the coronavirus." Abe set the record last year for longest serving prime minister in the 135-year history of the office, taking the title from Katsura Taro, who held office for 3 non-consecutive terms at the beginning of the 20th century, leaving office for the last time in 1913. Abe was first elected as prime minister in 2006, but then resigned exactly 1 year later in 2007. He reclaimed the seat in 2012's election and successfully defended it in 2014 and 2017. On the 24th of August, he also took the title of the longest continually serving prime minister from Eisaku Sato, his own great-uncle, who held the office from 1964 to 1972. Abe comes from a political family. His great-uncle and grandfather served as prime minister, and his father served as foreign minister. Over Abe's time in office, his central priorities have been his fiscal programs that have been dubbed Abenomics, a 3-pronged program to reinvigorate Japan's economy, and the amendment of Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which, since World War II, has prevented Japan from maintaining a military force or taking part in war. Abe's tenure has also been marked by a number of controversies, the most enduring of which being his revisionist views of history. This has led to accusations of media censorship designed to downplay Japan's role in World War II-era atrocities. He has also been accused of having imperialist sympathies, and Abe intends to remain at his post until his successor is chosen by the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. So that's some slightly unexpected news.
Oh yeah.
Now this was announced August 28th, and by the time this broadcast goes to air, This will have been a few days since then.
Just a bit.
So, yeah.
So it is kind of funny because I had just finished actually redoing the schedule for this series all the way through until December, and thought, okay, I've got every detail in place. And then the next day, his resignation was announced, and I had to go in and redo the entire schedule to edit everything in and have it make sense. So everybody, stay in your seats. We've got a good schedule of episodes coming all the way through until January at least.
No one else is allowed to resign.
Yeah, pretty much. Everybody
Or
else
postpone their election.
keep your political systems stable, everybody. We've got it all planned out.
Yeah. Anyway, back to Japan specifically. Yeah.
And there's not really much to say there, really.
No, it's not a huge election really, but they're going to be doing some political searching, racing to find who's going to be the successor for the Democratic Party.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, all I think there really is to say for this one is, I mean, Lord knows from the perspective of this show, we may not be the biggest fans of their prime minister being right-wing party, being right-wing perspective, and particularly in my case with his sort of revisionist historical policies. But I mean, we wish him the best of luck tackling his bowel condition, and hope for him to have all the best in the future.
Yeah. If you're listening, Abe, keep your stick on the ice.
Yep. Alrighty, and our next story on the ballot tonight has us heading to South America and the landlocked country of Bolivia. Bolivia's elections were originally scheduled for May 3rd, before being pushed back to September 6th, and now again to October 18th. The coronavirus pandemic was cited in all of these cancellations. 2020 was not originally supposed to have been an election year for Bolivia. The presidential elections were held on October 20th of 2019. The election was heavily contested as incumbent president Evo Morales and the ruling Movement for Socialism Political Instrument for the Sovereignty of the People, or MASIPSP, was seeking his fourth term and accused of authoritarianism and election meddling after a 24-hour pause in vote counting resulted in a shift from a tight race between the MASIPSP and Carlos Mesa's civic community. Mesa himself having also been Bolivian president from 2003 to 2005, after the resignation and exile of Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, in the wake of the Bolivian gas conflict that claimed 59 lives. The 2019 Bolivian political crisis spanned 21 days of civic protest until November 10th. After an audit by the Organization of American States, or OAS, was conducted, Morales was asked by the OAS and the Bolivian military and police to resign. He accepted Mexico's offer of asylum the next day, fearing for his safety and that of his family. The vice president, president of the Senate, and president of the Chamber of Deputies also resigned. Second Senate President, Janine Áñez, was sworn in as president on November 12th. Áñez has been accused of postponing the election to withhold power. The MASIPSP continues to control the Senate and has agreed under duress to the postponement. The Senate has also aided in passing legislation preventing Morales from running in the election. The fraud accusations against Evo Morales have now been questioned. Possible causes for unjust accusations include the installation of a right-wing government after 3 terms of his left-wing government, or racism stemming from Morales' status as the first indigenous president. In the most recent polls, Áñez and the Democratic Social Movement are counted as a third-place party, behind Carlos Mesa's CC party and the MASIPS under new leader Luis Arce. Alrighty, so definitely some interesting happenstances coming out of Bolivia, and definitely a good example of a country trying to get over a political crisis and run an election in the face of the current pandemic.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. The one thing I gotta say, man, Morales, imagine being in his position where you're basically being ousted by a third-party outsider, your military and the police.
Yeah.
That's a real attack from all angles.
And I mean, it definitely leads to an interesting circumstance, and particularly one that you see discussed, particularly in movies and pop culture a lot, relating to the United States. Of what happens if the president and the entire upper chain of command just suddenly disappear? And we saw that exact same thing happen here, of where the the top four in the chain of command all left office at once, and a third party, not even one of the two leading parties in the country, ended up in some ways assuming control just by sort of being in the right place at the right time when the entire chain of command was just gone.
Yeah, I mean, that was basically the plot of House of Cards.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. Yeah, so speaking of talking about the pandemic and stuff, in the last story we were talking about, shifting things around in order to talk about each country in a timely manner for the broadcast. Bolivia is a classic example of this. Originally, Bolivia was slated to be on the list for the first episode because, their election was originally going to be September 6th. And like the 11th hour of before we went into recording the first episode for broadcast, it's like, oh, Bolivia's been postponed. Oh, all right, got to make some last second changes to that one.
And it wasn't the only one there too, because as we'll be discussing later this episode with Hong Kong's election was actually supposed to have been, I believe, September 21st.
21st, yeah.
Yeah, September 21st. And then as we were going to sort of do the final edit on our notes for this episode, we discovered that it had been postponed until next year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Though at least there's still enough going on in the country as of current. But there's still enough for us to talk about this episode.
Yeah, exactly. And it'll definitely be interesting to see how the postponement sort of affects things with the protests and whatnot. And we'll actually see a good example of that here in Bolivia, where we had a political crisis that caused an election in what would normally be not an election year. And now the former president is barred basically from the entire political system, though it's yet to be seen if that was sort of a proper charge or if it was really just fiction that was created to try and oust the previous government. And with the current government also now being subject to accusations of trying to withhold power for longer periods of time and postponing the election over and over and over again to achieve this, it'll definitely be interesting to see what happens moving forward in Bolivia when the election does happen, hopefully next month. But I mean, it's been 3 postponements thus far, so we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Yeah. I mean, we're also seeing a very similar pattern in Hong Kong as well. With these postponements, and it really makes you wonder. You really have to, as citizens of each respective country, it's important to look into the true political motives of each of the ruling parties.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, something that doesn't really relate to the actual state of the election in Bolivia, but I thought is always one of the interesting things about the country is it actually has 2 listed capital cities, one in the south and one in the north, with one being the administrative capital and one being the cultural capital, I think is what it is in Bolivia. And that actually got me curious in looking at various examples of this. And I found one of the other ones was South Africa, with actually 3 listed capital cities, with Johannesburg, Pretoria, I think was the other one, and Cape Town.
Okay. Something rather fascinating.
Yeah. But the thing that I definitely look forward to seeing more of in Bolivia, or seeing how it goes, is even after Evo Morales being removed from power, the MAS-ISPS is actually still leading in the polls, and it'll be interesting to see how it moves forward, because it's a very left-wing party, and it's a very sort of open and inclusive party from what my research has been able to tell. Like it started out, I think, as an indigenous party. And that's definitely something that I like seeing in governments, particularly in the Americas or in Oceania, especially whereas we briefly touched on UNDRIP in our interview in the previous episode, but especially whereas when UNDRIP was adopted by just about every nation on the planet, it was rejected by Canada, the US, New Zealand, and Australia. So I like seeing countries that are sort of in the same sphere of influence almost as those countries actually promoting the rights of their indigenous people. And that definitely is something that happens under the MAS-ISPS, as far as I can tell.
Yes, for sure. So the next story on our docket this afternoon takes us into former Soviet Union territory with the country of Belarus, with their recently completed presidential elections, which were held on August 9th of this year. Incumbent President Alexander Lukashenko was reelected to a sixth five-year term in office with a total of 80% of the vote. Lukashenko has won every presidential election since 1994, with all but the first being labeled internationally as neither free nor fair. Opposition candidate Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya claimed to have won a decisive first-round victory with at least 60% of the vote and called on Lukashenko to start negotiations to transfer of power. Meanwhile, Tsikhanouskaya's campaign team created a coordination council to facilitate the transfer. Several peaceful protests began from the Belarusian citizens after the Central Election Commission of Belarus, or the CEC, announced the election results, deeming them fraudulent. All opposition candidates have filed appeals to the Central Election Commission, calling for the results to be invalidated. Many countries and international organizations, including the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Canada, refused to accept the results of the election. The European Union imposed several sanctions on several Belarusian officials as a result. President Alexander Lukashenko has been leading the country since the first presidential election held in 1994, consolidating power over the next few years. In 1995, he won a referendum that gave him the power to dissolve the legislature if he felt it unconstitutional. In 1996, he won another referendum that dramatically increased his power and also extended his original five-year term. This has led to his government to be perceived as an authoritarian regime. Opposition activists are often pressured or detained by the government. As of this recording, Lukashenko or those loyal to him control all the seats in both houses of the National Assembly, all judicial appointments, the media, and the CEC. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe reported that it would not be monitoring the 2020 election as it had not been sent a proper timely invitation. It had not recognized any elections in Belarus as free and fair since 1995. The only international observers in the country were from Russia, Azerbaijan, and a few other countries. Each of them have questionable democratic records. In examples of election shenanigans, in several polling stations, curtains were deliberately removed from the voting cabins, leaving them covered on only three sides. People were taking pictures of them in attempts to spread the word of polling interference. In the days leading up to the election, several journalists and bloggers were arrested on weak and suspicious charges or were denied accreditation to cover the elections. This makes over 100 arrests made since January. Honest People, an independent association in Belarus that monitors elections, reported having found 5,096 violations from observers. They also questioned the Election Commission's reported turnout statistics. The group said that around 70 election observers were detained over the course of the election. After state TV revealed the results of a Lukashenko victory, clashes between protesters and riot police broke out. Reports of injuries and the use of stun grenades and rubber bullets emerged. As polling closed, many internet service providers lost their routing, and the communication losses were widespread as police and military closed down most of Minsk. On the second night, protesters barricaded an area in said city, and security forces responded by tear gassing the protesters and using flashbangs. After being released from a 7-hour-long detention on election night following her submission of a formal complaint to the Central Election Committee, Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya was escorted by Belarusian security services to Lithuania. A few days following the election, Tsikhanouskaya released a video reading from a script following her detainment, promoted on state-sponsored media, in which she called upon the people of Belarus to stop protesting and accept the victory of Lukashenko. The strong change in message and demeanor of Tsikhanouskaya post-attainment led allies to insist the video was coerced, likening it to a hostage video. Several days later, Tsikhanouskaya, now in Lithuania, published another video in which she claimed to have won the presidential election with between 60 and 70% of the vote, and called for the creation of a transitional council of civil society activists and respected Belarusians and professionals to handle the transfer of power from Lukashenko. She also encouraged her supporters to sign an online petition calling for a recount of the election. All right. So yes, we've seen quite a stirring in Belarus over the course of their elections. Starting to see kind of a running theme with a lot with countries in the area seeing large long regimes of power being at least attempting to be overturned.
Oh yeah, definitely a running theme for the episode today is certainly political crises. Though I got to say, one thing that we hadn't actually talked about in this story is Sikhanouskaya's background prior to actually seeking the presidency. And my God, if that woman doesn't wind up as president of Belarus one day, it'll be a crime in itself. Because how she ended up running for office was her husband, who was a lead protester, was originally supposed to be running for office, and then he was detained by Belarusian authorities pretty much for that. At which point she announced that she was going to run in his place, and she actually ended up having to send her children out of the country after threats were made against her and her family from the Belarusian government.
Yeah, which is crazy. There's been a lot of talks of detaining dissidents in Belarus. In an earlier draft of the script, I listed several different popular either dissidents or opposition candidates, including a rather popular Belarusian blogger and YouTuber who had not only thrown his hat in the ring for the run, but also been making several comments following the election. And he himself ended up being detained after supposedly several thousands of dollars in cash were discovered in his residence.
Yeah, that was actually her husband, I think.
That's wild.
Yeah. It's definitely interesting to see going forward, because on the world stage, it's often Russia that's talked about as being sort of falling back to an old style Soviet sort of transition of power within the government. But honestly, I would say, as authoritarian and undemocratic as Russia's electoral system is, I would almost put forth that Belarus is slightly worse even, and that it more or less harkens sort of directly back to the height of the Soviet Union, even more than Russia itself does.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, that was the other note I wanted to mention. Here on election detection, we always like to make a particular note to point out instances of minorities and women getting representation in different governments and stuff. So I just want to throw in this little note. When Sikhanouskaya was gaining power through the opposition parties, Lukashenko was noted on record making several comments insisting that Belarus was not ready for a woman to be president of the country. And very shortly after those comments were made public, three of the women representing the main opposition candidates actually merged their campaigns, pitting called Female Solidarity against Lukashenko himself.
Yeah, that's actually something that we're seeing in the States as well. In one case, with this coming election, is all of the candidates for both parties in the state of Maine are actually all women, and it's definitely one thing that's really good to see, particularly in the States, as it's been sort of a hot button issue with them for several years, even with the breakthroughs that people like Hillary Clinton have made in recent years.
Exactly.
And especially this year with Kamala Harris now running as vice president.
Listen to over 500 radio stations from anywhere in Canada with Radio Player Canada, the must-have app that's as Canadian as you are. Smart, lovable, easygoing, fits in anywhere. From early morning hockey practices to late night after parties. Enjoy every type of radio station, anywhere, anytime. Listen through your phone, Sonos, Google Chromecast, Google Home, Amazon Echo, Apple CarPlay, and Android Auto. Download the Radio Player Canada app today. It's where Canadian radio plays.
There are some things that just resonate with us Newfoundlanders, like moose hunting.
Got to get me moose, boy!
A little nip of screech.
Yes, Lord!
And even going on the pogey.
And it's you I see, standing in the long line.
But there's one thing that every Newfoundlander can't resist on a Sunday afternoon, and that's a big feed of Jig's Dinner. Tune in to 93.5 CHMR FM every Sunday at 1 p.m. for Jig's Dinner. Join your host Roland Skinner as he serves up a deliciously diverse menu of Newfoundland traditional, country, and folk tunes to feed your Sunday afternoon music cravings. That's Jig's Dinner, every Sunday at 1 p.m. and only on 93.5 CHMR FM.
Hi, this is Luke Major from Mercy the Sexton, and you're listening to CHMR 93.5 on your FM dial.
Working your days together, nights spent making sure and
And for our next story tonight, we're heading to the Indian Ocean and the island nation of Sri Lanka. The political landscape of Sri Lanka has been a rocky one for centuries now. 150 years of British dominion over the island nation came to an end in 1972, resulting in a number of culturally driven skirmishes taking place across the island as its groups achieved self-determination. These skirmishes eventually resulted in the Sri Lankan Civil War breaking out in 1983 and continuing until 2009. While Sri Lanka has stabilized significantly in the last decade, it has still experienced some significant issues, the most recent of these being the 2018 constitutional crisis. The root of the crisis began under the presidency of Mahinda Rajapaksa and the end of the Civil War in 2009. During his tenure as president, Rajapaksa was accused of becoming increasingly authoritarian as he centralized more power to the presidency and developed close ties to the government of China. Rajapaksa and several members of his family and former cabinet are currently under investigation relating to accusations of corruption, as well as war crimes and human rights violations in the closing days of the war. The constitutional crisis began when then-President Maithripala Sirisena was targeted in a rumored assassination plot by the Indian government. The assassination plot has since been shown to have been fictional, but the damage done within the Sri Lankan government was very real. The government at the time consisted of the president's United People's Freedom Alliance and Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe's National Unity Party. The crisis began with the withdrawal of the UPFA following an unnamed cabinet member being implicated in the assassination plot. This move effectively ended the National Unity government that had ruled since 2005. In response, President Sirisena appointed former Prime Minister and President Mahinda Rajapaksa to the seat of Prime Minister and attempted to form a new cabinet. The dismissal of Ranil Wickremesinghe was immediately called out as unconstitutional, and Wickremesinghe refused to resign from his seat, stating his confidence in a backing majority in Parliament. For the next 7 weeks, both Wickremesinghe and Rajapaksa claimed the title of Prime Minister, with Rajapaksa stepping down after the Supreme Court ordered a stay on Sirisena's attempts to dissolve Parliament and ruled Rajapaksa's appointment to be unconstitutional. While the ruling officially ended the crisis, it significantly weakened the economy and polarized the nation as it entered 2019's presidential election and the recent parliamentary elections in August of 2020. President Sirisena did not seek re-election, making this the first time in Sri Lanka's history that no prime minister or president was seeking re-election. And the election was won by Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the brother of Mahinda Rajapaksa and former Minister of Defense. He represents the newly formed Sri Lankan People's Freedom Alliance and won the presidency with 52% of the vote to the National Unity Party candidate, Sept Premadesa's 41%. The parliamentary elections were held on August 5th. They also represented a landslide victory for the Sri Lankan People's Freedom Alliance. Mahinda Rajapaksa was sworn in for the 4th time as Prime Minister following their achievement of a majority government with 145 seats in the 225-member parliament. The former governing party, the United National Party, suffered their worst defeat in history, losing 105 of their 106 seats. The newly formed Samagi Jana Balawagaya alliance, led by Sept Premedesa, is the main opposition, with 54 seats. The Tamil National Alliance lost 6 seats from the 2015 election, but remained the 3rd largest party in Parliament, with 10 seats. The Parliament is rounded out by 12 more parties, with a total of 1 to 3 seats each. Alrighty, so we've definitely got an interesting...
There's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, scenario unfolding in Sri Lanka at the moment, and I gotta tell you, having a president and a prime minister who are brothers is, I call it sketchy at best, no matter where you are, but specifically having brothers that have been accused of war crimes in the past and have already systematically deconstructed their entire opposition, pretty much, in a country that's only been out of a civil war after 25 years for 11 years now. Seems like all kinds of explosives stacked on a trick candle.
Yeah, sounds like a new TLC show, Keeping Up with the Government.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, when I mean, just the sheer amount of things to unpack that have gone on in Sri Lanka in the last 10 years, really, is flat out mind blowing.
It's a wild ride, man.
Like this article in particular, I mean, particularly in Western media, we don't really. I don't know if there's any European listeners for this show or Asiatic listeners or just from anywhere that's not North America, and I don't know if you have it any differently than we do, but we don't really hear about things like this. So researching this one story was almost information overload at times, trying to actually get everything boiled down into a coherent format when you have the Civil War and the constitutional crisis, various elections, parties going up and down by, I mean, when you have one party that has over 100 seats in parliament, this is the first time I've ever heard of anything inside the party or outside the party leading them to go down in the next election to having just a single seat.
It was like watching Game of Thrones, but you start at like season 5, episode 3 or something.
Pretty much trying to figure out everything going on here.
There's a lot of lore.
Yeah, exactly, and especially in the case of where their current prime minister, Mahinda Rajapaksa, where he's been president and prime minister several times in the past, it really does sort of have shades of people we've discussed in the past, like Lukashenko. Lukashenko all the way. And Dukanovic and Putin and everyone that we've discussed in the past. We've used the phrase increasingly authoritarian regime quite a lot in this episode. And we've used it in reference to Mahinda Rajapaksa as well in Sri Lanka.
It's interesting how all these countries that have increasingly authoritarian regimes are having elections this year. It works out really well.
Yeah, definitely allows us to come up with something of a theme, even unintentionally.
If not, at least a really fun buzzword to repeat.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing that we've really got to keep in mind for Sri Lanka was the cause of the civil war being the East and the North, where the Tamil peoples lived, who are the minority in Sri Lanka, trying to establish their own country. So you realize that you have to look at it and realize that the political state in Sri Lanka, while it's better than it's been in some time, is definitely still fragile.
Far from being great.
And I actually looked at Sri Lanka on the Democracy Index, and they are still counted as a flawed democracy, which puts them, I believe where they were on the index was very near the bottom of flawed democracy, though. But that's still a step up from where they could be, and it's definitely somewhere to build up from. But it's definitely going to be, particularly with the results of their recent presidential election and parliamentary election, leading to the two brothers being in charge and the one party being in charge, that's definitely going to lead to some interesting repercussions in the future.
Our final story today keeps us in the relative region, bringing over to Hong Kong and their recently rescheduled election. Originally planned for September 6th of this year, it's been postponed by nearly an entire year to September 5th of 2021. In late July, Chief Executive Carrie Lam decided to invoke the Emergency Regulations Ordinance to postpone the election due to the resurgence of COVID-19 cases in the region. This decision has been supported by Beijing. The delay has been seen by pro-Democrats as a calculated blow because the party aimed to achieve a majority by riding the 2019 District Council landslide following several massive protests against the government and concerns about Beijing's new sweeping national security law imposed on Hong Kong. It was also seen as the latest in a quick series of aggressive moves by the Beijing authorities to thwart opposition momentum and neutralize the pro-democracy movement, as just prior, 12 opposition candidates were disqualified from running in the election, as well as 4 young ex-members of the pro-independence group Student Localism were arrested under the new security law for their pro-independence posts on social media. These ongoing protests were triggered by the introduction of a new bill titled the Fugitive Offenders Amendment Bill by the Hong Kong government. The bill would have allowed extradition to jurisdictions with which Hong Kong did not have extradition agreements, the main points of concern being mainland China and Taiwan. This led to concerns that Hong Kong citizens, as well as visitors to the region, would answer to the legal system of mainland China. This would undermine Hong Kong's autonomy and infringe on civil liberties. This set off a large series of protest demonstrations, beginning with a sit-in at the government headquarters in March of 2019, moving to a demonstration attended by hundreds of thousands in June of 2019, followed by a gathering outside the Legislative Council building to stall the bill's second reading, which escalated into violence that caught the world's attention. This bill has since been suspended and aborted. On June 16th, just one day after Lam suspended the bill, an even bigger protest took place to push for its complete withdrawal and in reaction to the alleged excessive use of force by the police during the protests outside the Legislative Council complex. During these demonstrations, 5 key demands were laid out by the protesters: the withdrawal of the bill, an investigation into alleged police brutality and misconduct, the release of all arrested protesters, a retraction of the official characterization of the protests as riots, and the resignation of Carrie Lam. Police in action when protesters and commuters were assaulted on Yuen Long on July 21st, and the police storming of Prince Edward Station on August 31st further escalated these protests. When Lam withdrew the bill in September, she refused to concede to the other 4 demands. In October, she invoked the emergency powers to implement the anti-mask law, likely to prevent protesters from concealing their identities, to counterproductive effect. Confrontations continued to escalate and intensify. While police brutality and misconduct allegations increased, some protesters began resorting to using homemade bombs and vandalizing pro-Beijing establishments and symbols representing the government. Rifts within society widened, and activists from both sides assaulted each other. The storming of the Legislative Council in July 2019, the deaths of an unaligned undergrad student and government-contracted janitor, the shooting of an unarmed protester, and the sieges of 2 universities in November 2019 were landmark events in these protests. Following the siege of the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, the unprecedented landslide victory of the pro-democracy camp in the district council election in November and the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 brought little respite. However, tensions mounted again in May 2020 after Beijing's decision to establish a new national security bill for Hong Kong before September. Many felt that their fundamental political freedoms and civil liberties were threatened by the introduction of this bill. The bill also prompted the international community to reevaluate their policies towards Hong Kong, which they deemed was no longer autonomous, which was the original intention of Hong Kong. The approval ratings of the government and police plunged to the lowest point since the 1997 handover. The Central People's Government alleged that the foreign powers were instigating the conflict, although the protests have been largely described as leaderless. The United States passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act on November 27th of 2019 to support the protest movement. And these tactics and methods have used throughout these protests have inspired other protests in 2019 and 2020, particularly the BLM protests and riots of recent months. Alrighty, so that was Hong Kong. So yeah, like Sri Lanka, it's been pretty unstable, though over a much shorter amount of time than what Sri Lanka's had to build up.
And Hong Kong's definitely been very prevalent on the world stage in the last few months with the protests going on there.
Very much so. And once again, looping back to the theme of young people being involved,
exactly.
I like to think part of the reason so much of it's been on the world stage is that a lot of it's been documented.
Exactly.
By the young. It's not just news crews trying to like get their way in there under, approved government gobbledygook. It's young people on the front lines filming with phones. And I feel like that gives a perspective that really few other news crews could possibly give.
Exactly. It's definitely way more uncensored than sort of the traditional way of broadcasting. Even when news crews were sent into active war zones, there's the stuff you showed, the stuff you didn't show, the stuff you talked about, the stuff you didn't talk about. Whereas someone posting a video on YouTube or sending it through whatever other channels, having it shared on social media, definitely allows a much truer perspective of what's actually going on.
Mm. And that's what I personally find most fascinating about the whole situation regarding Hong Kong.
Oh yeah,
and especially looking at the two sieges at the Hong Kong universities, is that's a siege. Like, if you imagine what like a siege looks like, that was the Hong Kong Polytechnic University.
exactly, and that's we talk about it's happening in a much shorter period of time, but particularly I find even just on the world stage, especially looking at Hong Kong and China and the States, it really harkens back to sort of the 70s through 80s, because we're talking about university sieges. There were several of those that took place in the States towards the end of the Vietnam War, with the most famous one being in Ohio, being immortalized by the song by Neil Young. And particularly here, where they're talking about one of the key demands being the declassification of the protests as riots. You think about it, that might seem, if you just look at it topically, as a matter of semantics, but it's really not when you think about the fact that these are student riots. These are mostly young people getting out there and having their voices heard. And you think about the fact that this isn't the first time that we've seen this happen under Chinese jurisdiction, with Tiananmen Square being back 31 years ago, and it's still not recognized as even ever having happened in the Chinese legal system.
Yeah. If you've seen, I remember there was a video a few weeks back of a guy who was actually on the ground in one of the larger Chinese cities attempting to interview people about the anniversary of Tiananmen Square, and many of them openly denied the existence of the event.
Exactly. And that's definitely something to keep in mind here with these protests, is it's not just one side versus the other of we want to do this, no, we want to do this, no, we want to do this. Hundreds of people died in Tiananmen Square. It was literally a massacre. It was a state-sanctioned massacre, and in the official eyes of the government, it just didn't happen. So it's quite literally, in this case, a matter of life and death.
Mm.
And that's talking back to the similarities between the similarities and the differences, I guess, between the U.S. and China right now, and the callbacks to the Vietnam War era and whatnot. That's another thing that I thought was kind of ironic in this case, was the U.S. being staunch, outspoken allies of the Hong Kong protesters, all while being very authoritarian towards their own protesters and carrying out tactics that in some cases have been literally prohibited as war crimes.
Yeah. Yeah, eat your heart out, Lafayette Square.
Pretty much. It really makes you look at things and sort of take a critical eye of them and realize that it's, in both cases, it's definitely a very, very serious circumstance. And in a lot of cases, it's being, like in the States in particular, it's being very politicized. And it's not a case of, it's nothing to be politicized. In both cases, it is, as I said before, life and death.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, literally the same tactics that the Hong Kong government were using on the protests, a lot of the United States military was using on the United States citizens. In fact, to the point that a lot of, back in November, December, when several Hong Kong protesters were sharing via social media ways to protect oneself from stuff like rubber bullets, tear gas, pepper spray, were straight up being recycled and used by U.S. citizens during the Black Lives Matter protests.
Exactly, and it really shows something that we discussed in the last episode as well, which is no matter how much you try and cut it up into bits and you look at this is happening under this government, this is happening under this government, globalization is very real and definitely something that's moving forward and something that really needs to be brought in and nurtured and really accepted in order for us to really get anywhere as a society.
And at the very least, one needs to pay attention to these patterns.
Yeah, exactly.
Because if there's one thing, even just within these 2 episodes alone that we've recorded so far, there are so many patterns of regime changes, even just within the last few decades.
I mean, particularly in this episode, as we're discussing various different places, the fact that we have themes emerging just by coincidence in the span of 1 hour-long episode.
It's really quite fascinating.
I mean, that's actually the only other thing I really had in mind to discuss regarding the Hong Kong protests is the postponement of the election being cited as a case of postponing because of the pandemic is definitely very interesting when you look at sort of the fine print there, where they're postponing because of the pandemic, and then the government, for its own protection, is passing an anti-masking law. That's very hypocritical and really kind of shows who their priorities are to protect.
Yes, it really is.
Yeah.
Though at least there was a bit of a timeline between the introduction of the anti-mask law and the postponement of the elections.
Yeah.
The anti-mask law was introduced much earlier in the pandemic then.
Yeah. Though
you have a global scale.
You have to wonder, though, where the anti-mask law was introduced early in the pandemic, and the strong correlations that have been shown between centers of the pandemic and outbreaks and whatnot in areas that don't use masks heavily versus places that do. You do have to wonder if someone in the back of their mind was thinking, okay, that's a long game.
That is a way to think about it.
Yeah. I mean, not to reach for conspiracy by any stretch of the imagination, but you do have to wonder.
Yeah, if someone's thinking about playing the long game.
Yeah. Alrighty, well, that's just about all the time that we've got for our program this afternoon. We hope you all enjoyed yourself, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. If you like this series and want to hear more, we air new episodes every 2 weeks on CHMR, with the episodes being rerun the week after the initial airing. Our next episode of this series will be published on CHMR in the usual time slot of noon on Thursday, October 1st. And in that episode, we will be traveling to Europe to check in with Lithuania on the eve of its next parliamentary election. Then we'll be heading to Central Asia to check in with Kyrgyzstan and the neighboring country of Tajikistan, before heading back a little bit closer to home to check the standings of the U.S. presidential election as it goes into its final month of campaigning prior to their November 3rd election. And we'll be revisiting some of the elections in Canada that we discussed in the previous episode, and discussing the coming elections in Saskatchewan and Nova Scotia, as well as reporting on the results from New Brunswick's recent provincial election, and discussing Newfoundland's recent change of premiership under the Liberal government from Premier Dwight Ball to Premier Andrew Furey. For more information as to where you can find this series after its initial air here on CHMR, we have Johnny Robertson.
If you like what we do and want to follow us more on the production of our shows, we have a Instagram at Flea Market Productions. And following the broadcast on CHMR, these episodes will also be available on YouTube under the same handle, Flea Market Productions.
And we really do encourage you to check out the social media and the YouTube channel for this company. You can find on YouTube not just reruns of this series and past episodes, but there will also be, particularly coming up in the next few months relating to a few of the elections that we'll be covering, there will be sort of special YouTube events and some YouTube exclusive features and YouTube exclusive episodes. If you check on the Instagram, you can also receive information on the upcoming episodes, as well as at some point in the future, there will be information on possible other series. Well, not strictly possible other series, but series that we have planned that will be coming down the pipe sometime probably within the next 6 months or so, though we don't have a set timeline for any of this as yet. But yeah, if you want more information on really anything to do with our company, check out those channels. If you want some features that you won't otherwise be able to see, check out our YouTube.
All right. Thank you very much for tuning into our show. I'm Johnny Robertson.
And I'm Charlie Cutro.
and we'll see you next time.
See you later, everybody.